Okay guys, I'm here with Peter Jenkins.
Hi.
Now Peter is a retired counsellor. He used to work for Manchester University and now he's part of a group called Thoughtful Therapists. So Peter, do you want to just start by just telling us a little bit about your history and how you got into counselling and psychotherapy?
Okay, yeah, thanks. I was a social worker originally. I worked in Stockport for a number of years and then moved into working at the local college where I was helping to train other social workers who wanted to work in residential care, and gradually got very interested in counselling. So I became a student counsellor within the college, and then the college, being very entrepreneurial in those days, because I was doing it, they wanted me to run courses in it. Right. So I started running counselling courses. Then I retrained as a counsellor,
okay,
and that became my main profession, if you like.
Right. Yeah. And now you're a member of Thoughtful Therapists.
Yes,
okay,
that's right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Thoughtful Therapists is an organisation which was set up around about 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah. And the main focus for us as a group is to question and to challenge the way that gender identity ideology seems to have taken over the counselling professions. And a part of that is there is something called the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding on conversion therapy. Perhaps talk about that later.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of concerns about the way that is impacting on counselling practice, counselling training.
So is that MOU, were they actually telling you how to do your job rather than give you, your own autonomy to do what you used to normally do?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I can talk about it now.
Yeah, let's go straight into it. Yeah,
I mean, it does sound strange because if you read the MOU, it's a very short document. I mean, it's signed by the great and the good. I mean, all the major organisations from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, NHS England, the major therapy bodies within the UK, they've all signed up to this. So it is strange to be completely outside, the ones outside this tent, if you like, when all the major professional bodies and some of the major employers of counsellors and psychotherapists in the UK are all signed up to this. So it really seems like, well, why would you want to be out of step? What could possibly be wrong with a policy agreement which is against something that everybody seems to agree is a bad thing, which is conversion therapy for people who are gay or lesbian or who have a gender identity which is incongruent, it doesn't fit their natural sexed body. I hope that kind of gives you a flavour of it.
Yeah, just explain for people that don't know what conversion therapy actually is.
Well, okay, I'll try and be brief. I mean, conversion therapy is the idea that somebody who is, say they're gay, they go along to see a therapist, and either by subtle means or by more direct means, the therapist tries to persuade them that being gay is not good for them, it will lead to mental health problems or whatever. So it would be an attempt to try to convert them to being heterosexual. Right. I mean, you can imagine how unsuccessful that's going to be, but and of course, in the 60s and 70s, there were examples, particularly within the fringes of psychiatry and the fringes of psychoanalysis, where some therapists did attempt to do this. That seemed to die out round about the 1970s, the mid-1970s. But what has really gained people's attention is that with the massive increase of the numbers, particularly of young people coming forward around about 2014, 2015, saying that they were concerned that they were in the wrong body. So a young man who really felt that he was a girl instead, that if they went to see a therapist, that the therapist would say, well, you shouldn't be thinking like this is not, it's not normal in psychological terms. So what we need to do is to try to keep you on the straight and narrow and return you to being comfortable with your sexed body. So that would be conversion therapy. So, in their terms.
Right, so basically what they're saying is that a child comes to you,
yes.
Okay, a young girl, young Julie is saying, I'm young Johnny,
yeah.
And you can't then say to young Julie, well, why do you feel like this? Is there anything else going on in the background?
Yes.
What is going on that's made you feel this way? You can't question young Julie like that.
This is where it gets a bit complicated, because if it was as black and white as that, then it would be I suppose it'd be a case that there's no debate, because you would be acting as a therapist in a way that was trying to effectively coerce your client into thinking or behaving differently. It'd be coercive therapy, and coercive therapy is, by definition, it's unethical.
Right.
If someone comes to see you, whether it's a child or a teenager or an adult, it's got to be on a voluntary basis.
Yeah.
So that would be the first problem with that. So I think the overall difficulty is that the memorandum itself, if you read it, it appears to open the door to what we would call exploratory therapy, which is the example that you were giving. You were saying, well, okay, I understand what you're saying. Tell me more about yourself and what's going on in the family that you feel free to talk about, and help me understand why you think that you are Johnny and not Julie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It appears to open that door, but in practice, there's every indication that's a concession, but it's through gritted teeth, because really what they want us to do is to affirm and say, well, that's great. So shall I call you by your preferred name? If it's a child, then when your parents come for you at the end of the session, would you prefer that I don't tell them anything about this? So it's just between the two of us. And of course we know that once you go down that road, that secrets immediately raise safeguarding issues. We try and protect our kids by saying, if you're with an adult, even a trusted adult, don't get in a situation where there are secrets between you and them. So therapists are at risk, by keeping that kind of secret. I mean, any parent would presumably want to know if that's going on with the child. From a compassionate point of view, they would be concerned.
Yeah, and part of what I say when I'm on the streets to the general public, part of this is a war on the family unit, and this is absolute direct evidence that this ideology it's putting you and the child against the parents.
Yes.
And I see a lot of this happening in schools as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is a major personal concern to me, because I've been involved in counselling training, research for about 30 years, and given my social work background, I was particularly interested in the law relating to working with children and young people, and coincidentally ended up writing a number of books about this. And one of the things that particularly interested me was something called the Gillick principle, which people...
Do you want to explain that to some people that might not know?
Yes, yeah, the Gillick principle, it's always puzzled me why this isn't more widely known, but it's a really important piece of case law. In the mid-1980s, there was a woman called Victoria Gillick, and she wanted an assurance from the health authority that if any of her daughters went to see the GP under the age of 16 to ask for contraception, the GP would refuse, but also the GP would get in touch with her, because she argued she had a right to know what they were talking about. And she fought the case all the way up to the House of Lords and lost. And out of that came what is called the Gillick principle. And the idea is that for young children who are under the age of 16, that they can have confidential discussions with the GP or a school nurse, or logically with a counsellor, if they have enough understanding in the eyes of the professional. So, I mean, obviously that's quite a difficult area to manage and negotiate, because if you're a counsellor, if you're a counsellor in school, you have to be able to suss, well, does this child really understand what they're asking for here? Obviously not asking for medication, but in terms of what they want to talk about within therapy. Is there a risk to the child where I have to break the confidentiality? So how do I manage that? And so the Gillick principle is at the heart of all of this. My concern is, in a nutshell, that I think that it's being misused within schools and within school-based counselling to keep parents out of discussions which are absolutely crucial for them to have an awareness of. And that is where a child is having concerns about their gender identity, that they feel they might be in the wrong body. I think parents have a right to know.
Yeah, it sounds like the Gillick principle is an attack on the family unit as well.
Well,
is that a bit harsh?
I'm caught between a rock and a hard place here, because the Gillick principle was really used, and I think in a positive way, from the 1980s on, to open up the possibility of child-centred counselling, particularly within schools. And a large part of my career was trying to promote that, develop that, but in a very responsible way. So you had a space, it's not an absolute freedom, but you've got a space where children who might be concerned about, I don't know, the death of a grandparent, or the birth of another child in the family, they can go and talk about that. It's not absolute secrecy, but it's a degree of confidentiality. And obviously as parents that can be a bit concerning, but I think it's taken out of context when it gets to this level.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so the main thing that affected your profession was this Memorandum of Understanding. How did your colleagues react when that happened?
Well, it's been a very long, slow process, and some people talk about the analogy of boiling a frog. I mean, you don't put a frog in hot water, but you just turn up the temperature a degree at a time. And it's taken me quite a while to really work backwards through the policies of organisations to see, well, where did this come from? And
that's my next question as
how
well.
did we get here?
Yeah. Where is it coming from, and how did your colleagues react to it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it goes back to, there was quite a dark period within counselling, psychiatry, psychotherapy, where there was this period of oppression, if you like, of gay and lesbian people back in the 1960s through to probably no later than the mid-1970s, when it really did fall out of favour. And this was an attempt to use things like aversive electric shock therapy so that people who were gay would be shown photos of the same sex, the opposite sex, they'd be given electric shocks. And this was an attempt to try to shock them back into heterosexuality. That sounds quite extreme, yeah. It was quite barbaric and unethical, and you can imagine completely ineffective.
Yeah.
Sexual orientation is simply part of our nature, if you like. So there was that period, and then this resurfaced around about 2009. There was a case of a journalist who went to see a counsellor and said that they were concerned they might be gay, they didn't want to be gay, they wanted to be straight, and the counsellor took the bait and said, well, if we can work with you to overcome this. So it
was like an undercover operation, was it, to expose counselling?
It was a journalistic attempt to really see what response they could get from a therapist.
He wasn't acting in good faith, he wasn't genuine, he was trying to see what...
I wouldn't want to go too far down that road, but certainly, I mean, it got a response from a counsellor which was very far from being mainstream. I mean, because as a counsellor, you're trained to work with people of every sexual orientation, and it may not be the issue they want to talk about. They want to talk about relationship issues or childhood or whatever, but it's not a problem. It's not seen to be problematic by the therapist, or it shouldn't be. But the response of the organisations, the professional therapy associations, was to say, right, we need to make it very clear that we draw the line here, we don't support this, we don't accept it as being ethical practice. And there was a statement issued by my own organisation, which seemed pretty uncontentious at the time. Then 2015, there was the first Memorandum of Understanding. This was on sexual orientation. And again, at that stage, it seemed to be, well, this is just good practice, so we'll all put our name to this. But then 2 years later, there was, following a period of intensive lobbying by the trans lobby within the organisations and outside, organisations like Stonewall, very briefly, then they added gender identity.
I was waiting for that.
And it was nodded through. And I guess I have to hold my hands up, because at that stage, I wouldn't have had more than the haziest of ideas what gender identity is. But if our organisations are saying that therapy to change it is a bad thing, you think, well, okay, and you turn the page and read something else. So, and it's only since then that the penny has dropped. In my case, it didn't drop for another 4 years, that this is a very important development. There's a world of difference between a sexual orientation, which is part of human nature, it's a behaviour, it's part of the spectrum of human sexuality, and gender identity. Yeah. Nobody can define gender identity without using the words gender and identity. Yeah. It's an idea, it's a belief. So there are no agreed criteria for what is a gender identity. There's no test for it. You simply have to take it at face value. If the client says, my gender identity is, I don't know, neutral or non-binary, then you simply have to nod and say, well, there's no way. How can I distinguish between any of these? I just have to take what you say at face value. If you say it's a problem and you want to go through social transition or medical transition, then I'm completely stymied. Normally, as you said before, you'd say, well, that's really interesting. Tell me more. Like, where do you think this comes from?
Yeah, and it just slipped in under the radar because nobody knew what it was. There's been a long march through the institutions. I always talk about this, and this is a great example of it. Yes. And it's happened without public awareness.
Absolutely.
And you're even telling me now, even professionals like yourself, it slipped in, under the radar without you noticing it straight away.
Yes.
Now, you said that there was heavy lobbying from like trans lobby groups, and I know one of the big world organisations is WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. Now, that's probably the biggest lobbying group globally. And do you think that they're behind this Memorandum of Understanding that was brought to the psychotherapists?
That's a really interesting question, because the MOU is something which looks as though it is completely homegrown within the UK, although interestingly, they recently exported it to Ireland. Right. And they didn't change it in any way. So with it's kind of warts and all. And suddenly what has seemed to be appropriate for the UK through a whole process of internal debate and so on, suddenly is okay to be exported to Ireland, and again without proper discussion and debate within the associations there, from what I can see. Now, WPATH is, as you say, I mean, it calls itself the World Professional Association. In fact, it's not, because something like 2/3 of the membership are American.
Right.
And roughly around 1/4 to 1/3 of its members, I mean, its members, about 3,000 globally, they're not medics, they're not therapists, they're not professionals, they're not researchers, they're trans activists.
Yeah, a bunch of cranks, I say, but,
Well, I mean, that may be a legitimate way of running an organisation, but I think the concern is that where you get people who are totally, absolutely committed to the notion of gender identity, for which, as I say, there's no test, it's a belief system, You either accept it or you don't. It's not something that's verifiable. I mean, so if you have depression, for example, it doesn't go simply on someone saying, well, I feel depressed. You know, you have a set of criteria that a GP would normally work through in terms of appetite, cognition, feelings of worthlessness and so on. There are criteria to decide, well, this person is just having a bad day, but this person is clinically depressed. You don't have anything like that for gender identity. WPATH and some of the organisations which produce psychiatric manuals would say, yes, there are criteria for gender dysphoria, but I think even that is debatable. We really need to be convinced, I think, that this is a medical or a psychiatric condition as opposed to, if you like, a set of ideas that someone has grasped and internalized to make sense of a great deal of internal distress. Because it's, I suppose, one of the arguments is that gender identity is innate. Again, we've no way of knowing. It's immutable, doesn't change. Again, we don't know, because it does change for some people. But with WPATH, it's partly an activist organisation, and you have a situation where its role within UK has never been properly appreciated. In America, it's there as soon as you start to talk about any of these issues, you run up against a very, very well-oiled, very well-financed PR response. They're very, very powerful in the States. You have a huge medical insurance business that is right behind the gender medical industry and so on. In this country...
Kaiser Permanente is one of the main insurance companies that are part of that.
It is, yes, yeah, because of course they don't have the National Health Service in America, so if the child or teenager or adult wants to go through medical transition, then it's done on medical insurance.
Yes.
So that there is, if you like, a whole industry which is built around this. In the UK, it's different. WPATH's membership is round about, I think it's about 64 people.
Right.
So it's tiny.
Yeah.
But if you look at who those members are, they're all key players within the adult clinic of the Tavistock, which ran the Gender Identity Development Service that we've all heard a lot about. Also, people like Susie Green from Mermaids, a key player. She was a member. The chair of Memorandum of Understanding is another member.
Right.
Helen Webberley, who runs Gender GP, one of the leading private providers of what gender-affirming healthcare, so-called. Yeah. Again, another member. So the key players are members of WPATH, but it's not widely appreciated. It's not widely known
who they are.
Yes, and the fact that WPATH, you couldn't put a sliver between the policies that these people and their organisations are promoting and WPATH's own statements and their standards of care, for example.
Yeah, so just to go back to one of the name that you mentioned there was Susie Green from Mermaids. Now, Mermaids were heavily influential towards the Tavistock Clinic in pushing their policies through, and this was the affirmation policy primarily. And what people might not know is when Susie Green's son became 16, she took him to Thailand for his birthday and had him castrated, had his penis cut off, his testicles turned inside out, and then affirmed as a female.
Yes.
So Susie Green, and this woman was highly influencing the Tavistock Clinic, highly influential in government, and I didn't realise, and you're telling me now, she was highly influential in WPATH as well.
Well, Susie Green, I think, was involved in the production of the Standards of Care 8, which came out in late 2022, and this is, if you like, is the reference book for practitioners of gender-affirming medicine. I mean, within thoughtful therapists, we take issue with the language. The language is crucial because if you are persuaded to talk about things in a certain way, then it's as though they become true, and it's very difficult to keep your distance from it. You know, so if you're talking about gender identity, if you're writing it, you can put inverted commas around it. But I mean, it's as though, well, this is a real thing we're talking about here. But it isn't. It's a belief, and it's not the same as sexual orientation. Yeah. So the language determines, if you like, what is possible to think about.
It's easy to fall into the trap as well of using their language.
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, I wanted to link it back as well to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychiatric Disorders.
Yes.
Now, what we are now calling gender dysphoria used to be called gender identity disorder.
Yes.
And it was lobbying from the people at WPATH that got it changed from disorder to dysphoria. So that kind of like depathologizes the condition. It's saying it's not really, if it's a disorder, there's something wrong.
Yeah.
But what they were able to do was to keep, even though they took it away from being a disorder, they kept it in the manual of disorders, but just changed the name to dysphoria.
Yes.
And what that crucially did was allow the dysphoria to still have an insurance, a diagnostic code for insurance purposes, so that the insurance companies would pay out for this condition.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and that is absolutely essential within the American market, because WPATH and its medical practitioners and its supporters in the world of therapy there. And of course, we have to remember that in America, that counsellors play a key and very different role to the role of counsellors here, because in order to go ahead with medical transition, then a teenager or an adult has to get a letter of recommendation from a counsellor in the States.
Right.
It used to be 2 letters, but they reduced that to 1. And that letter can then be shown to the gender-affirming clinician who's going to carry out the actual surgery or to prescribe cross-sex hormones or whatever, again in the States. And what is absolutely crucial is that it is judged to be medically necessary. Now, you would hope that anything involving drugs or medication would be judged to be medically necessary. But if you look at the fine print, if you pull the language apart, then it has to be medically necessary in order to get reimbursed. And you can imagine that the clinics and the drug dispensers and endocrinologists and so on are not going to give this stuff away for free. So for them to be paid, it has to be judged to be medically necessary. But from an ethical point of view, you can challenge this and say, well, how is it possible that a mastectomy, a double mastectomy, the removal of the breasts of a teenage girl in the States, how can that possibly be deemed to be medically necessary? Because it is not necessary to stop the spread of disease. It's to try to align the body more closely with the preferred self-image of the client. It's, if you like, an extreme version of cosmetic surgery. So this is very troubling. Of course, it's different in the UK because we have the National Health Service, but the National Health Service seems to have been very extensively infiltrated by these ideas. And if you look at the role of WPATH, for example, it's there in the background in the standards which was set within the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service and also its equivalent in Scotland. So buried there in the fine print would be a reference to WPATH standards of care. So they're very, very influential.
They're everywhere.
But you really have to look for it, and you have to try and understand that working backwards from the school-based counsellor in your local school in England saying yes, to the child who's going to say, well, I sometimes think I might be in the wrong body, and them affirming it, that tallies with the MOU, that tallies also with WPATH. So there's a trail of association here that is really worth unpicking, but you have to know how all of this hangs together.
Right, so that trail follows all the paperwork. If we follow the money trail, where does it lead?
Well, in America, this is big business. I mean, so WPATH, every time there's an attempt within the United States at the state level to try to limit the gender-affirming medicine. I mean, I don't feel comfortable using the language, but that's the way they would describe it. About half the states have outlawed this, certainly for under 18s. And WPATH immediately then gets its lawyers together and they encourage a legal challenge to that to get it overturned. They're losing business, clearly. But also from an ideological point of view, then they see this as necessary to spread the word that any attempt to limit gender-affirming care can only be the result of bigotry or Republican-held states at the
far-right Nazi.
Well, and it shades off into sort of all the associations that right-thinking progressives would want to be against. But this is not, it's not as simple, I think, as a right-left issue.
Right.
This is much more complex than that.
You could argue as well, it is a very capitalist movement because there's so much money. You know, the left wing tend to be anti-capitalists, but there's massive amounts of money. So it's almost they've got this radical far left to support big business without them knowing it. That's kind of like how I see it.
That's almost with a separate discussion, because I think that, I mean, for example, WPATH, if you look at its policies in real detail, then it seems to be absolutely opposed to government monitoring or government intervention within American medicine. So it's almost as though they're arguing, and I've heard advocates in this country who follow the WPATH line, that really the relationship between the doctor and the patient is the start point and the end point. So if the patient is saying, doctor, I want this medical transition, I want the cross-sex hormones, I want to go through this operation, then their argument is that this should be up to the patient. It's informed consent, they would claim, I doubt it, and it's up to the healthcare practitioner to say this is medically necessary, which translates as this is financially necessary. Now, what we have in Europe is a kickback against that, if you like, and starting with Finland and then Sweden, Norway, the UK, you've had a counter movement to this, which is state medical bodies saying this is not simply about the autonomy, the choice of the patient in saying that they want to go through this process, and it's not up to the medical clinic or health centre to say, well, yes, you can certainly have this. That this has a lot of implications for society in general. We don't know where this comes from. The whole diagnosis process is very questionable. The background research is, as Hilary Carr said, it's remarkably weak to be carrying out physical changes on someone that will result in lifelong dependency on medication.
That's the follow the money trail I was thinking
Well,
of.
yes, I suppose within the UK, it's less obviously about money. It may be more obviously about ideology. Because, of course, within the NHS, the doctors are not being paid directly. That may be their role to work in a gender identity development hub or whatever, or to carry out the operations or prescribe puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or whatever. But I mean, they're not being paid. It's not quite the free market that you have in America, but it's the ideology is still there.
Yeah. So if it's ideology driven, and you mentioned there about the impacts that these things will have on society, I'm trying to get it into my mind. I'm trying to work out, if we allow this to happen, what will society look like in 10 or 20 years? I say this is a war on Western society, but where do you think this will lead? It's a big question, that.
Well, it's hard to know. We seem to have come a long way since I first got interested and joined Thoughtful Therapists 4 or 5 years ago, and in some ways it's been a case of the tables turning very, very gradually within America, within the UK, that there is, when I started in 2021, it seemed like we were, those who disagreed with the MOU, those who were critical of WPATH, were a tiny minority, and we were on the back foot completely. Now, things have changed. I mean, they've changed in America with the re-election of Trump. Yeah. And on one particular policy aspect, he has been absolutely forthright and issued executive orders, which is really to close down the medical industry from providing gender-affirming care. He's also authorised a massive research program, which is to look at the difference between the research that is claimed to prove that this is beneficial to clients and patients and the actual research outcomes, which show that
That's interesting.
it really doesn't stack up in that way. And of course, you've had the pushback from the Western European countries where they've done systematic reviews, they've looked at the evidence, and I mean, with the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service, there were a couple of very influential studies carried out by NICE, the National Institute for Health Care and Health and Care Clinical Excellence, and they really threw doubt on, first of all, the role of puberty blockers in pausing puberty, and secondly, cross-sex hormones. And Hilary Cass came in, the Tavistock was closed down, it's going to be moved to regional hubs, as we know, and she also authorised an extensive research programme at York University, which again shows that the research which WPATH has claimed to show that it's all above board and it's all very progressive and beneficial, it doesn't prove any of the things that it claims. So we've been blindsided by bogus research.
So talking about research, you'll be painfully aware that Hilary Cass said that we need more research in this area, and she recommended a puberty blockers trial on children.
Yes, yeah.
And it's like, what are your thoughts on that? We're experimenting with chemical castration drugs, because that's what they use Lupron and triptorelin, which are the two puberty blocker drugs in the United States, to chemically castrate sex offenders.
Yes.
And now, as a country, the government give £10.7 million to King's College in London to conduct trials of these drugs on young children, up to 250 children, I believe, maybe more.
Yes, I think that's...
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it shows the limitations of Hilary Cass's approach. In many ways, if we put the randomised control trial to one side for the moment, I mean, I think that Hilary Cass's approach has been very, very welcome. And first of all, in closing the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service, and in moving it to regional hubs, the question is, who are they going to be staffed by? And if they're going to be staffed by gender identity followers, then all we've done is metastasize. We've spread the cancer throughout the body rather than stop it in its tracks. But the one thing which is really important for us as counsellors and psychotherapists is that Hilary Cass said very clearly that in working with children and young people, that the main approach should not be medical, that it should be psychological, that we start from the point of view, which is you said earlier, where we have a young person who comes in and they're expressing these ideas, then obviously we are compassionate, we take it seriously, but we try to unpack it, we try to explore it, we do explorative therapy. It's not a different kind of therapy. This is what we've always done with any issue, and we need the freedom from pressure by colleagues or organisations. This is our job. We simply want to be able to get on and do this. And Hilary Cass appeared to be saying, this is what we need to do. And the silence from our own therapy associations, who you think would seize this with open arms in the way that they jumped on school-based counselling 15 or 20 years ago, and I had some minor involvement in that, they've just ignored Hilary Cass. They've not engaged with it, they don't discuss it, they won't accept articles on it. It's as though it hasn't happened. So I think that this is a major opportunity for those of us who work in therapy or are concerned about it to be able to open up the whole of this area, particularly, I think, within school-based counselling, where young people classically, I mean, you know, these are the kind of concerns they bring.
Part of the indoctrination grounds, I believe, the schools.
Well, there's a whole area here where schools have been politicised, and they've taken whole areas of social policy upon themselves, which are completely outside their remit. Schools don't have the expertise, they don't have the resources, they don't have the funding. It's not part of an educational role to try to provide a safe setting for social transition for young people. This is a psychiatric intervention. So they're not skilled, they're not qualified in this area. They should leave it alone. And obviously you treat a young person with respect and compassion. It's not a job for teachers, teaching assistants, head teachers to get involved in at all. In terms of the randomised control trial, do you want me to come back to that? That is the
absolutely.
issue of the day, isn't it? Because I think one of the flaws, and it's so easy to see this with hindsight, because when Cass came over the horizon, I mean, those of us who were concerned about this issue just thought, well, this is a breath of fresh air. This is the beginning, the turnaround, hopefully, where we can practice in a traditional mainstream way with our clients. And now we have the apparent backing of Hilary Cass, who's saying, first of all, you need to explore with the young person. And she was saying, for example, it's very relevant. We need to know that why is it that something like 40% of the children who were going through the GIDS, the Gender Identity Development Service, at the Tavistock, were diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum? Is there a connection? Not necessarily a causal connection, but you know, is there something about the way a young person who's experiencing distress in a broader sense might see this whole process as very black and white? I feel uncomfortable with my skin, I can't relate to people, I don't make eye contact with them, well, perhaps I was born in the wrong body. I mean, it's a leap to go from that, but then become very fixated, very kind of focused on that as a solution. If I was at my proper gender, I wouldn't experience these things, you know. So, I mean, the difficulty is, I think, that with Hilary Cass coming from a paediatric, a medical background, then obviously there is a commitment to carrying out clinical trials. And that's normally what you would look for. What we have at the moment, if you track back the prescription of puberty blockers to give young people supposedly time to think, you pause the puberty, that's a myth, you destroy their puberty. You supposedly give them time to think and decide, do they want to go ahead with this? And of course at the Tavistock they found that 98% then did, because they were part of that very closed worldview, and they progressed across sex hormones. So it wasn't time to think in any realistic sense. Usually what you would do is look to the evidence, and of course the evidence base for this was something called the Dutch Protocol. If you go back to the early 2000s, then working with a very, very different group who didn't have the same level of psychiatric distress, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, suicidal thoughts and so on. It was a very different group, roughly 50% male, 50% female. And the idea of introducing puberty blockers at that stage was to avoid them developing secondary sexual characteristics, which would then need to be removed and make it more difficult to pass as the opposite sex in the future. It was a tiny sample, so it was 54 in that sample. And of course, given the period of when it was done, there was no opportunity to follow it on a long-term basis over 20, 30 years. Yeah. Now, the mistaken policies of the Tavistock were all based on this tiny, tiny sample. And I think what Hilary Cass is trying to do is turn the clock back and say what we need is what we would normally go for, a randomized control trial. So you allocate children to different groups, you probably have a no treatment group, a placebo group, and then at the end of that you evaluate it. But what we've got is a bodge, because there'll be two groups, one who are given puberty blockers and another group who will be given puberty blockers later.
A year later, I've heard.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. So
they no actual control group.
There's no control group because the whole thing is so politicized that young people who are entered for the survey, if they were given a placebo, they would suss this and there would be uproar. But the concerning thing is that the randomized control trial, the justification is that this is what young people and some parents want. And that's not a rationale for giving anybody anything. I mean, the fact is, as a doctor, I'm sure other people have had this experience. Sometimes you're convinced that you need a certain treatment or medicine or whatever. You go to the doctor and you say, well, I've listened to you, but in my medical opinion, you don't need this, or there are side effects which you're not aware of, and I'm not going to prescribe it. So medicine is as much about denying treatment, if it's inappropriate, as it is about meeting consumer needs. So the fact that this is something that young people and some, not all parents, are clamouring for is not an ethical justification for doing it. And we already know that there are adverse side effects to puberty blockers. That's already been established.
You actually said that, what the trans rights activists will say is that it's just a pause on puberty. I think you use the words, it destroys puberty. Can you enlighten us on that a little bit?
Well, the idea is that puberty blockers would stop someone going through a normal puberty. So if it was a girl developing breasts, having periods, if it was a boy, then all the hormonal and physiological changes that go along with that. And that would give them time to think and to reflect on whether or not they really wanted to proceed. As we know, once you're on this moving walkway, then the chances are very much that you will be even more convinced that you need to move on to the next stage, which is cross-sex hormones, where you have...
It's like the first step along the process, isn't it?
Well, this is what
the first step of affirmation.
Absolutely, yes, yeah, or even the second or third step, and the first step would be seeing the psychologist or the counsellor and say, yes, if this is your lived experience, that you've struggled with this for a number of years, then I'm absolutely behind you, and yes, we'll talk about it, but we'll move you on to this moving pathway as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So do you know what are the physical effects then of the puberty blockers on a child's body?
Right. Well, I can't talk in detail about the medical side of that. No.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've just read quite a lot from, there were kids that were put on it. It's licensed for what's called precocious puberty.
Yes.
So young, predominantly girls going into puberty from the age 6 or 7, and put on it for such a short amount of time to pause the puberty, just to stop a young child, having periods and things.
Yes.
That's what it was licensed for.
Yeah.
But what I've discovered actually is that some of these children that were put on it at early age, they've had reduced cognitive ability because they actually did tests on the kids from an IQ point of view before and afterwards, and they dropped by something between 9 to 15% of IQ points as well. And I've also been contacted by people that were put on it, and then they said that they can't do very much manual work now as they've got older because they've got brittle bones. So these are some of the effects. They'll say, oh, it's a pause for the puberty, however it does have a detrimental effect on you later in life. And we know all this, and we're still gonna put these young kids from the trial, in the UK, from the recommendations of the CAS review. They're like, for me, they're sacrificial lambs, okay? And they're going to sue the pharmaceutical industry and the government in the future, because even now, the people that were put on these drugs for precocious puberty, they're suing Pfizer, they're suing the big pharmaceutical companies. All this information's out there, but we're still doing it.
I mean, I think it's huge. Well, it's more than concerning, because it is flying in the face of what we already know. So, I mean, going back to Gillick, for example, what came out very clearly, there was a judicial review brought by Kira Bell, who was a detransitioner in 2020. And she brought a case which was to question the way in which the Tavistock was managing this whole process, and also to question whether children could consent to undergoing this kind of medication, like puberty blockers. And it was as though you lifted the lid and saw what was going on underneath the flagstones. And I mean, just being appalled by this, because there was consent. Young people did agree to it, but what the court correctly concluded was that children, and I think youngest was 10, were not able to give informed consent to decisions which would have an impact on their sexual development, on their fertility, on physiological adverse effects such as osteoporosis, for example, and that puberty is a natural process. I mean, it's not always comfortable or painful. I mean, it can be pleasurable. It's not the worst thing that happens to everyone. It's a natural growth process that we all go through. But the idea that you could take young children and them to consent and kind of fast forward. Well, I won't mind at 40 that I can't have children, for example.
They can't consent to something that they don't know.
That flies in the face of developmental psychology and children. I mean, I think the court at that stage concluded correctly that they weren't Gillick competent for this. They could not give their consent to this. It's doubtful as to whether adults, possibly under the age of 25, could give their consent to this.
Take the case of Richie Herron. He was 29 when he went through all this. So, if we're going to kind of wrap things up now, what would your advice be to parents that have children that have maybe been groomed online or heard things from the friends group or heard things from school, and now they go to the parents and say, Mum, Dad, I think I was born in the wrong body, or I think I'm non-binary. Where can parents go for help?
Well, I mean, my heart goes out to parents in this situation, because I think they're faced with a very difficult choice here. I mean, on the one hand, they might be shocked or horrified by what their child is saying and want to know more about it. And I think, I mean, it's not for me to give advice to parents, but I mean, just to try to respond calmly and neutrally, and just kind of, again, want to explore, where does this come from? And if, is hearing about this at school or your friends? More probably it would be picking things up on social media. And I mean, there is a very strong case that social media absolutely has lit a fire under this around about 2014, 2015, where you see the numbers going up exponentially for this. So to respond as compassionately and neutrally as they can initially, that I think we're in a very different situation now, that there are stronger and stronger professional voices speaking out against this. We've been through the absolute catastrophe of the Tavistock and come out the other end. There's still a long way to go, but there are now groups of professionals who see through the whole of this charade. We see it for the nonsense that it is. There is research which is growing in strength. I'm doing research on detransitioners, for example, and that's just such a powerful corrective to all of this. You know, their view of how they were when they were, you know, pushing to go on cross-sex hormones, and their view now, 5 or 10 years later, and you know the scales have fallen from their eyes. You know,
the activists are scared to death of the detransitioners getting their story out.
Absolutely, this is the Achilles heel of the whole project, and you know the efforts that have been put into try to discredit detransitioners. If we're going to talk about lived experience, we have to include the lived experience of detransitioners. I mean, there are organisations out there which are there to support parents who want to get more information. For example, the Bayswater group, there's Our Duty, there are therapy groups which offer support services. I mean, there's GenSpec, for example. There's another organisation, Therapy First.
Right.
I mean, one of the problems that we've had is that therapists who don't take this gender-affirming, uncritical acceptance view are really thin on the ground. There are organisations like Just Therapy, set up by James Esses, who went through his own court case. So the resistance is growing.
Right.
And there is help out there.
Yeah, and what I'll do, I'll put links to all those organisations that you mentioned. I'll put links to them into the description of this video, so you can actually go to those directly underneath now, guys, and leave a comment and everything. So is there anything else you want to finish with before we wrap up, Peter? It's been really great to have you, you know, and you've got that breadth of knowledge that goes beyond what I know. I feel like I'm just a layman that's just grabbing all this information, but it's been really great talking to you. Anything you want to finish with?
I think we've definitely turned a corner. I mean, it's not the beginning of the end, but it certainly is the end of the beginning. You know, that the whole of this malign industry is really now on the back foot, and it well deserves to be there.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and I'm part of the fight back as well. You know, and I would like more people to do what I do as well, guys. I don't want to be the only person that's going out on the streets doing this. But I understand that people can't do it because they are, you know, they are tied to their employer, and a lot of the times the employer has been captured by this as well. But what people can do is speak to each other. We can talk about this a lot more nowadays, and the more that we talk about it, the more we raise awareness, and the more, you know, the more chance we've got of stopping this. Yeah, I think you. Thank you, Peter. It's been amazing.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.
Okay.